Tangled in seaweed. Deep in the mountains of a dense forest, a group of people were camping. They gathered around a roaring campfire and sang songs and roasted marshmallows. After a while, a man began telling scary stories. Most of the group loved this, except for a woman named Julia. Julia didn't like scary stories and asked the man to stop. But instead of stopping, the man got a wicked grin and asked the group if they had heard about the serial killer that was recently caught in the area. Everyone in the group was very curious, even Julia, who was scared stiff. The man began telling the tale of the evil man who had gone on a killing spree within these very woods. The police eventually captured him, but to this day they had never found the bodies. They searched the woods high and low, but had no luck, and the killer refused to tell them. This scared Julia even more than the ghost stories. She shouted at the man to stop talking about it and ran off to go sleep in her tent. Eventually, the whole group headed to bed, but Julia had trouble falling asleep. She couldn't stop thinking about the serial killer and the missing bodies. But eventually, she did fall asleep, and morning came. The following day, the group was going down to the lake to swim. The water was cool and murky brown. You could only see a foot or two under the surface until it turned into total darkness. However, the group did not care. They jumped and splashed and had a lot of fun. Before they knew it, the group had swum far out into the middle of the lake. The water was extremely deep and dark. The worst part of it was since the water was so murky, every time a slimy piece of seaweed touched them, they couldn't even see it. This scared Julia quite a bit. She hated the feeling of the weeds tangling on her legs. After kicking off a few slimy pieces of seaweed, Julia felt her foot become tangled in another. This time she struggled to shake it off. The seaweed had firmly tangled all around her ankle. Something about this seaweed made Julia feel uneasy. It wasn't slimy like the other seaweed, but instead long and stringy. She wished the water wasn't so murky so could more easily see it to get it off. Julia cried out to the others in the group. When she told them of the strange debris stuck to her legs, they replied that it was only seaweed. It grew wild in the lake, and all of them could feel it on their feet, too. Julia shouted that it was stuck to her foot, and the others simply told her to yank until it came free. And so Julia thrashed her leg about until she felt the seaweed snap away from the stalk. Relieved, she reached down to pull the foul weeds off of her leg, but when her hand made contact with it, goosebumps went down her spine. What she felt in her hand was not a plant. Slowly, Julia brought the strands to the surface. What Julia was clutching in her hand was not seaweed after all. It was a clump of long, blonde hair. Julia then got a terrible feeling in her gut. The others looked at her in shock. They too had a bad feeling. Despite how scared she was, Julia had to know. She took a deep breath and dove under the water. It was hard to see at first because of how murky the water was, but the farther down Julia swam, She could begin to see something, and it was something terrible. Staring right back at Julia were two glossy, glazed over eyes. Julia was staring at a pale white body. It was floating lifelessly in the murky water, with a rope tied to its ankle. And over near Julia's friends, she could see even more bodies, and their long hair floated up and wrapped around the swimmers' feet. A feeling of dread overcame Julia. She sprang back to the surface and screamed. She now knew where the serial killer had been hiding the missing bodies.